Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody back. This is the second class of the Georgist Ecology course that I'm teaching. And it's good to see some repeat people, and we have two new people. So that's always good. You know, we can always catch back up, or if you haven't read the material, I think you can catch on. We're gonna, the format was that we did allow people to ask questions during the period if there's something that's unclear. I think in some cases we might put things to the end. I guess one thing I did want to take care of, there was two things that we left off from the last session. I'm going to start off with that. The course that I'm teaching here, it's melding three main ideas. One is economics, ecology, and I get into the Georgist theories about land rent. And I also get into the concept of infrastructure, because I think the thing that's been missing in the Georgist analysis, the Georgist teachings, is the importance of urban infrastructure. And I think with the talk that I'm giving tomorrow and the material that I'll be doing in the rest of this class, I think it'll start getting understandable. Because the infrastructure that I'll be getting into, there's 14 types, and you'll see the 14 types. This is where these are the services and the buildings and the structures. These are the things where a land tax would go to that creates wealth in a city. There was three main things to read for today. So let me ask, the most important thing to read, since this is a Henry George School of Social Science, is the abridged version of Progress and Poverty. So everybody read the first 68 pages. I know some people have read it, and now that they're back. So if you've read it within the last week, month, that qualifies, I think. What was your name?
Sandy.
Celia?
Sandy.
Sandy, okay. So Sandy, I think you mentioned that you read the entire book. And I think the last 50 pages or so, it was seeming like it was written yesterday in terms of the problems. So that's the main thing. Now there's two other things. Now, there's no grade for this class. So ideally, you would be staying up past midnight and reading all this stuff, but it's not really necessary. I'm encouraging you to excel. If you only read this, that's okay. And the other two things were excerpts from my dissertation, which is the evolution of water management institutions, and the other one was the German economics. But I'm going to be going into some of that material here. And I got some slides over here. So let me get back to the two things that I left off. What was your name again? Rob? Ralph? Okay, Ralph. Okay, so Ralph asked about fracking. And I thought it might be appropriate to talk about that today. The other thing was the idea of encouraging professions. The gentleman who was sitting in the back there, I can't remember his name, but he was...
Dr. Adams.
Dr. Adams? Okay. So Dr. Adams was talking about, isn't it interesting that in the past they talked about careers? Now it's just jobs. Maybe I flip burgers, but even if you're flipping burgers, there is a science to running a hamburger operation. So I guess that was one of the things I was going to get to. So the first thing I wanted to get to before we get into today's lesson was the difference between Pennsylvania and New York. Can somebody tell me the difference between Pennsylvania and New York in terms of hydrofracturing? Well, I think it's just the laws allow the oil companies to come in and do what they have to do to get the oil, the methane out. So you asked my opinion about hydrofracturing. Hydrofracturing versus what?
Coal.
Coal. Oh boy, this is trying to think if that's really a question that's relevant to this course. I mean, in terms of comparison. On the one hand, methane is a simpler chemical. It burns cleaner. Coal has a lot of problems on its own. I would say there's pros and cons to the point where the potential for damage might be more locally with higher for the hydrofracturing because of the use of the chemicals and the polluting of the aquifers. And once you contaminate aquifers, they're pretty much gone for a very long time. The effects of the coal use is on the climate change. Another thing about coal that some people aren't too familiar with is that there's a lot of metals in coal that when they burn, they go up in the atmosphere and then fall back down. Throughout Mississippi, for example, I know about this, is that there's streams and rivers and people are eating fish and they've got high mercury and they say, well, I don't understand this. Well, it just happens that there's the wind patterns are such that the coal plants were billowing out the smoke, the mercury goes in the clouds, it rains and goes into the creeks, and so it's this web of life. So the answer to your question is that they both have problems. They're both hydrocarbons. One of the things that I didn't mention when I started this class is that I'm a professional civil and environmental engineer. I'm also a certified hazardous material manager, which gives me some credibility with this Flint, Michigan thing. But I'm also a passive house designer, and this is a German technology where you don't need to burn fuel in your house for your comfort, and it has to do with design principles about making the house airtight and high insulation value. But I didn't want to go into that. But it's kind of crazy to be ruining aquifers to get gas, to put it into buildings that don't need to burn gas. A lot of these passive houses that are being built now, they don't have a gas service line, so they're not going to blow up. And that's what we should be going for. And a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking throughout this course is economics, ecology, and satisfying human desires without impacting the environment. It's just a smart thing to do. So I don't know if that answered your question enough. Okay. There's challenges with a lot of different things, but rather than go into too much more on that, the other thing was about the professions is that I agree with Dr. Adams. Was that his name? Okay. That we really need to look at that division of labor, and I'm going to be getting into the comparison of this concept of the Washington Consensus. Does that phrase mean anything to anybody? What the Washington Consensus is? This is what American trade negotiators, like the World Trade Organization and all these free trade agreements, they believe in this Washington Consensus, and I'm going to be getting into that. And I'm comparing it side by side with 9 principles for economic development that were written about 40 years after the 30 Years' War in Europe, 1648. It's an important time period. But the idea behind comparing those two ideas is that the ideas of what it takes to develop a society, nation, neighborhood, city, they've been known and they've been used for over 300 years successfully. And I'll be getting into some ideas about, by and large, we've been lied to about a lot of different things. And I think the thing that's important is that we need to understand the lies, understand the deceits so that we can respond immediately when we hear it, say, you know, that's a pile of shit, or whatever you need to say. You might be in polite society, so you might need to watch the way you use words. So what I wanted to do now is to just go through some of the concepts in the first 60 pages of Henry George. Now there's an axiom of political economy. Is that the way he says it? What is the basic axiom? Can somebody cite that? Yeah, one way to think about it is that if you are a musician, maybe you do other things to earn the money for your apartment or your food or something. So it would make sense to do something with the least exertion so you can pay your bills so that you can spend more of your time in music. So I think what Henry George is getting at in the book is that there's just a principle that people like to do things with the least exertion so that they can satisfy their other desires. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to do it, but I think what he's trying to is come up, what he was facing when he started writing this book, he saw so much illogical things, the whole idea of progress and poverty, like the sign that you're making progress are the mansions, but also the beggars in the street, and no matter wherever you go throughout the world, you saw the things happening. And he described this wedge that was pounded into society as if you can look at lower class, upper class, and you're just pounding that wedge, and you don't see that wedge if you're up here. And if you're below that wedge, it can't get any worse. So I think what he's trying to do is step back and see the effect of political economy on driving that wedge, or what is the wedge. And he gets into what that wedge is as we get further in the book. And that's the loss of wealth through the capture of the land rent that we're going to be getting at. It's really no secret that Henry George was all about capturing socially generated wealth. And that's his whole program. And he goes in quite a bit of detail saying that the land, which we all know to be the natural opportunities, are common property. It's kind of a radical thing to think about, considering the fact that common academic talking about common property really didn't come around until the 70s or 80s. That's some of the material that I got into in my dissertation when I talk about evolution of water management systems, and we'll talk about Elinor Ostrom, after a while, but I'll probably keep this up here during the whole course, because this is very good information to have, because it's the result of years, maybe decades of research on cultures across the world, across thousands of years, across cultures, that if there were people on Mars, they probably do the same kind of thing, because it's just natural if you're going to use a common resource or a common pool, you cooperate. You know what the boundaries are. You know who's within your pool that you're sharing stuff with. So if you see somebody new, you say, well, welcome, I'd like to talk with you a little bit. You know about our common arrangement here? And, oh, well, yeah, I was just passing through. So clear boundaries, memberships. You have rules on how you share resources. Collective choice arrangements. So you kind of cooperate and you say, what's the best way of operating for, if it's a water supply or a meadow where your farm animals are going out, or your tree, forest, a lot of different common pool resources that Elinor Ostrom studied. Right to organize institutions. So it's like there's nobody from the outside saying, oh, you have to have all men, or you have to you have to not meet on Sundays, or whatever it is that your group wants to do. It's collective choice, the right to organize institutions, monitor collective decisions. So there's a history involved in the one that's probably the most famous is in the Swiss Alps. There's a continuous use of these common pool principles for 1,000 years for how animals are grazing these lands. So there's a long history of collective decisions. Range of sanctions. So people get out of line for some reason, like the old man passes away and the son comes in and he's running something, looking after his family's property. He says he's going to do something different. He's going to try to privatize something, and that's not part of the rules that everybody agreed to. So there would be some kind of sanctions that everybody would agree on, and it's not to beat him over the head, but it's like let's come back to the fold, and this is how this thing works. Low-cost conflict resolution. So this is related to the range of sanctions. So lawyers aren't making billions of dollars to keep this thing going. It's like people want it to work. And then the last one is making this work within the hierarchy of the government that you're in. So if you had a common pool arrangement in North Korea, it's going to be different than if it was in Cuba or Norway or something. So you have to be aware of the outside pressures. So I wanted to introduce those because it comes up again and again on what does it take to be in a cooperative arrangement. So that was good. That was a good discussion about the least exertion. It's a principle that Henry George brings up right at the beginning, and he repeats it several times. You'll see that italicized in the book, just to remind you that this is what the science is all about. Now, the next main idea that Henry George gets into in the beginning of the Progress of Poverty is the idea that labor, or that the capital is advanced for labor to work. Is that we're all waiting for that money to appear, and then therefore I'm going to go make my widgets. This is a very basic idea, and it's actually revolutionary once you understand what he's saying, and it's at the basis of his whole philosophy, because the way I put it last week, we might have different words here, but this is the basic idea in Henry George's book, because once you grasp it, then you understand how different it is from the way you've been taught, the way people talk on TV. They always, I was looking at, last year I was at the Left Forum and I was presenting stuff about economics and such. And I started out with a clip because I'm trying to remember the guy, Gray in Baltimore, the guy who was, what was his name? Freddie Gray? Okay. Okay, so Freddie Gray gets beat up and he dies. And so there was a story on NPR about what's being done to improve Baltimore so it can get better. So the NPR economic correspondent asked the guy who's trying to develop the neighborhood, well, where does the money come from to do what he wants to do? Or the taxpayers may not want to fund this kind of thing. This is getting into this kind of what I call slave and citizen mentality. And once you understand that banks create money out of nothing, that even makes this even clearer about the choice that we have in what we do and how we do it and how we create wealth. So it's important to understand this concept here. From last week, does somebody want to tell me the difference between where the labor's wages come from, whether it's in the slave model or versus the citizen model? Anybody remember how it was presented, or maybe just from the textbook about that labor or wages don't come from accumulated capital? The labor is producing wealth. That wealth comes to the labor today. Let's say I used to work at Lockheed Martin for 28 years, and I think one of the I don't know if the word is funny. It's interesting. You know, interesting could be a lot of different things. But I went to the production line for the F-35. Everybody knows that's a fighter jet. It's got all this whiz-bang stuff. And the assembly line was, there's a jet sitting there maybe 1 day, 2 days, 3 days with nobody working around it. Then someday 2 guys will come with drawings and look at it and measure it. So what they're doing, they're getting paid on the future value of that jet being created. It's not some slave owner over here who made tons of money on cotton and he's going to pay somebody to go pick some more. I mean, that's what the slave mentality is, that you have no input on the wealth that's being generated. And I think that's the key to understanding George, is that there's a participation, there's a nexus, there's like a citizen would say, you know, I'm producing this wealth, and you know, the way we're producing it, we're polluting the river. And somebody would say, well, we don't really have to pollute the river. Why don't we do it this way? So there's a back and forth. There's an involvement in what you're generating. And I think that's the key to this. But it's so important to understand this concept because it's laid out very clearly in the front of the book, and he keeps on repeating it. And if you can remember those 2 things about the axiom of a political economy, that we pursue our human desires with the least exertion, and that wages are paid by the wealth that's created. I think that's a very important point to get across. I'm thinking that probably best to look at the course schedule. So for today, we're going to read, like I said, the German economics and the evolution of water management institutions. Next week, we're going to be talking about the fisheries papers, and then we're going to read chapters 8 through 20 in the Progress of Poverty. So we'll be getting more into some of the ideas we brought up last week, so I'm going to minimize what I talk about fisheries. I introduced it last week. I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to go into the slides. Is there a button on this thing? Is this? I don't think that's connected to that. Yeah, did you want to advance this? Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of slides on this. Oh, okay, wait, well, no. So this is my name. So I had, there's a lot of slides that look like the same, but I'm changing things and the sentences come up. So what would be the best thing to do? I think we covered probably the most important things in the first 68 pages. Anybody who's read the first 68 pages, is there something that confused you, or maybe something that needs to be discussed? You know, they were talking about what interest is, what capital is. You might recall people who weren't here last week, I handed out what's called class notes.
Class notes, did I get that?
So you maybe next week you can make copies?
I will make it now.
Okay. So in the class notes, I go into a lot of the definitions. So I think as we go into this class, you can always refer to the first class notes. And for example, the definition of capital and the pages you can go to get that. I think that, so let me go into these slides, and I think what we'll do is use that as the basis for the discussion tonight, because I get into the materials. We talked about Eleanor Ostrom, talked about some of the concepts that I came up with. Maybe before we get into slides, let me just point out, when I did my dissertation, I worked real closely with actually the author of the two papers you're going to read next week, a guy named Daniel Bromley. You'll see his name on the first page of my dissertation. He's professor emeritus of University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's in Germany right now. I guess he's staying there maybe full time. You can look at some YouTube videos. He's got, if you put in the words vulnerable people, vulnerable states, you'll come up with a YouTube video of him giving a lecture to students and workers from Africa and other developing countries, asking them questions about the book that he wrote. The book he wrote was 2012, and very critical of the so-called war on poverty, essentially saying that over 50 years we've spent all these millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, and nations in Africa and in the Middle East are very little better off. And it was just the wrong approach. And a lot of the problem with the approach was the so-called Washington Consensus, is that if you only have free trade, if you only give tax breaks, if you privatize, there's all these prescriptions that might be appropriate for advanced countries that have developed their countries, but when it comes down to I've got goods here and I need to go to the city and the street has potholes and people who are robbing me on the way to the market, you can't abide by what might be common sense in the United States. And that's essentially what he's talking about in vulnerable people, vulnerable states, is that you need to have the mechanism set up. You need the infrastructure. And that's why it's so important to understand what infrastructure is, because once you have it, you've got a wealthy society and you've got the basis for what people could and maybe should be employed at. It's almost insane that we have people who are unemployed and we've got roads that need to be fixed, transit that needs to be improved, schools that need to be improved. There's social investments that should be made because the payback is so much more that you just do it. And that's the concept of good and a sustainable infrastructure. I got it back here in here. Daniel Bromley. He's Bromley. And it's going to be a challenging paper. The first one, he does mention Henry George, so that's always a good plus when an economist talks about Henry George. So the presentation I'm going to be making is the infrastructure canary in our governance coal mine. You kind of understand the analogy there that it took little kids to get poisoned for this issue to be put on the radar, and it's a shame that it had to get up to that. So the things that I'm going to be covering is the disaster in Flint. Flint is just one of thousands of examples. Infrastructure report card. Now when I say infrastructure report card, for example, who writes the infrastructure report card every year and it gets on the news and they say, oh, we got a D+, we got a C-. It's civil engineers. I'm a civil environmental engineer, and I always thought that it was a mistake for them to be the spokesman for the infrastructure report card, but I'm going to be getting into that.
Why do you say that?
Well, for example, who should do it? Well, it should be the public, it should be the mayors, should be the county executives.
They don't know anything about this stuff.
Well, that's the problem. Why did we elect them? Last year I was at an architect meeting and I brought up the infrastructure needs, how much it costs and what is needed. And there's an architect who's very well known, a public official, who said, oh, engineers, they just made that up. This is a guy who's in his 60s, maybe 70s. He ran a major agency in New York City. And he was just saying, oh, the engineers just make this stuff up. So what I'm saying, and that's the point of this presentation, because at the end I'm going to be inviting people to join me to develop the standard for the mayors and the county executives and the governors to use so that they can be effective. So infrastructure report card is something that the American Society of Civil Engineers write, because it's kind of like if you ran hospitals and you saw them getting worse and worse and worse. Sooner or later, the nurses would say, you know, we need to have better hospitals. And then the people would get tired of the nurses saying we need better hospitals, because people are going to say, oh, that's just so you can get better salaries. I mean, people are so cynical. That's the problem with civil engineers saying, oh, our infrastructure is at a D-, we need to spend, they estimate $3.6 trillion over the next 4 or 5 years. I mean, that's a lot of jobs. Sounds like FDR, doesn't it? And what happens when it's built? Land values go up. And what can you get with higher land values? Revenues to keep them going, So all these things make sense, but none of this information is fed to you logically. It's like these greedy engineers, they need money, you know. So anyway, the next point was management systems. There was a guy who was going to be on this panel tomorrow that I'm talking, but he couldn't make it on Friday. But he's an expert in management systems, and I'm going to just give it a little bit of information about what those things, because it's important that, for example, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, that they operate smoothly, that they don't have overlap, that they've got a job to do to deliver water, and they do it at a reasonable cost. That when they do something and it requires good construction methods, they don't skimp, so that they don't have to redo it in 5 years. And those are the kind of things involved in management systems, is just working smartly. So there's an aspect of management systems involved in what I want to do, but it's not the thrust. It's kind of like the difference between Henry George's economics and somebody like Milton Friedman, who says, well, we should just privatize everything. So they're both economists, but it's like a world of difference between what you're trying to get at. I want you to pass these out. What I'm passing out is a sheet of paper that the emergency manager at Flint, Michigan should have written out. What he should have proposed to say, we're going to switch our water from the safe source of water to the Flint River. We're going to save $5 million in 2 years, and it's a cinch. Now, the thing that you see on that form is there's a place for a professional engineer to sign. They didn't have a professional engineer sign when that guy says, oh, let's save $5 million. He did it on his own because he thought that people wouldn't know, let's just do it, whatever the reason. So an aspect of what I'm trying to get at is some accountability, so that if somebody has an idea for an improvement, let's think it through. You've heard of measure 3 times and cut once, so it's kind of like that. But also think about the ramifications of what he did. There's 14 types of infrastructure, and I'm going to be talking about them. So his decision to change the water supply system affected public health and future education, the environment. So it's like 3 or 4 downsides of his decision that he didn't even think about. So it's like we got this public wealth in all these infrastructure systems, and some idiot who has no authority, has no concept of what he's doing, just does it and decreases the wealth that's common to us all. We should be outraged because Flint had enough problems as it was, and this guy invented one. So I don't know if that answered your question, but okay. So management systems.
Do you think this is a failure in the decision-making system?
Yeah, well, if we have it the way that I think would have some accountability, if you're changing water from this to that, I think it would be important to ask a chemist, to ask an engineer. Maybe they could have a list of when you make these kind of decisions and get a sign off from these people. It might be a phone call, it might be an email, but at least you've got some documentation that I talked to these people, they said it's a good idea, let's go for it. I'm going to talk about the delusion of the piggy bank, and I'll get to what that means later. I'm going to talk about that money is not wealth. The fraud of the 2008 bailout of private banks. The insanity to pay banks to hold your money. The next one. Wipe out the 2 quadrillion in financial aggregates and maybe we'll sleep better. The next one. The Washington Consensus versus Horneck's 9 points for development. What's the next one?
What's the founding numbers?
I'm sorry?
The alternative that you...
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the comparison between the so-called Washington Consensus and the ideas of a German economist in 1684, over 100 years before Adam Smith. Stark differences between an economy based on trade and barter, which is Adam Smith, and an economy based on production and distribution. The origin of wages, we kind of already talked about that. Help create a standard guide for infrastructure. Question, should vacant land be taxed at the highest rate? Most people are going to say, well, what does that have to do with infrastructure? I'll say it has a lot to do with infrastructure. So by the time I'm done, I'm going to ask a question again, and I hope somebody from the audience will say, oh, okay, I get it. So the next one. So the disaster in Flint. So that's the water. You can see how orange it is. Corroded water that's brown will suggest that it might be iron. I'm not sure what the color of lead is, but I remember seeing some pipes in Flint and they were like yellow or something. I'd have to think about, what lead looks like when it's oxidized. I know when copper oxidizes, it turns green. So it's clear that there is some iron. We know that was high in lead content. So the next one. So what's going on in Flint is pretty well, it should be expected. I read a book and I noted that there's 8 stages of risk communication. They didn't have a table in that book. They just reported several case studies going back in the 70s and 80s. Citizens ask questions, officials have no answers. Next one, the media fills a vacuum, the officials stumble. Third one, officials communicate poorly, sometimes it's nonverbal, they just are flummoxed. So, next one, officials talk down to the victims of exposure risk. Maybe they weren't doing that well in school anyway, so what's a little lead? Realization that the risk is real and release documents. So you can see we're getting over this hump where, hey, there's something really here. You can have all my emails. You remember that's what Governor Snyder did. He said, I have nothing to hide. Here's all my emails. And I think they had a firewall, kind of like Governor Christie not knowing about the George Washington Bridge. It's like, oh, I just hired stupid people. That was his excuse. Number 6, citizens demand total removal of risk. So this is a situation where you're dead to rights, you screwed up, we want the whole thing fixed up, and so that's where they're at right now. They're looking at like $74 million to do 15,000 lead pipe removals.
What they do in the meantime? They have no water.
Well, they've got bottled water. They're spending probably about $5 million on bottled water, the money that they thought they were going to save on that water switch. Then number 7 is advisory committee forms, Chamber of Commerce. This is all kind of like the 70s, 80s. If you think about Love Canal and all these other disasters, this is the procedure. And if you think about it, and number 8 is officials take well-considered action to lower risk. So if you think about it, do you really need to go through the first 6 if you're competent, if you know what you're doing? One of the things that I was debating whether to say at this conference is we need to stop putting people in positions of power who have no effing idea of what they're doing. I mean, that's what's going on. And if you had competence, you would say, hey, we got a problem. Or maybe advisory committee on should we change out this water? And they say, well, no, I don't think it's a good idea. Or what's wrong with the water we got now? What could be the downside of that? And right now we could say, well, look at Flint. And then they'd say, well, maybe we won't do it. But in most cases, 7 and 8 is all you really need in terms of risk communication. I mean, why would you put people in office that would talk down to victims? I mean, in the old days, they would get into his house and tar and feather him and run him out of the city. I mean, that probably should be done, but I can't say that. So 1988 is when that book was written. So it's like, it's not a mystery. There's 8 stages. So let's look at what happened in Flint. How did Flint play out? What's the first step here? So April 2014, they made the switch to the Flint River. The next one is city says, oh, you have to boil your water. There's bacteria. There's a lot of other things in there too. And the next one is citizens complain. There's no action. So that was the first step in that guide that I was saying. So you can see it was almost, if you go to the other slide, the earlier slide, it was almost like this is how it started, then it got worse. It's kind of interesting that they collect those bottles that way. Yeah. And then the next one was the protest. You can see the face of the governor. They've got these crosses, they got a banner, people gathering. I think they're at the state capitol in Michigan. So the next item on the timeline is GM stops using the water. It's too corrosive. So it's ruining cars, but kids can drink it? This is insane. So So let's get the tar heated up, you know? So let's put some more wood under there. So what's the next one? Detroit offers to reconnect for free. And this is a year ago, and the city declined. Governor plays down the crisis. You can see step 3 and 4. You know, it's not that big of a deal. And this is about a year ago. And then the next one is there's a doctor. Remember the Indian woman, Dr. Mona something, finds high blood levels in kids. So it's getting to be real. There's something really there. So the next one is local public outcry. That's 6, saying we need to dig up all the pipes. We need to get something done. Next one is the governor orders distribution of filters. Well, it's something, but it's not enough. And then the last one is Rachel Maddow has a town hall meeting. In a sense, that's the media really getting involved, which was number 2 in that list. But it's also, you know, getting people together to solve the problem. So you can see it plays out. Yeah. So shouldn't be that much of a mystery. So Flint is really just one of thousands of examples. It's unfortunate that Flint had to go through this trauma in order for people to recognize that there is something about infrastructure that's important. You understand why politicians don't like to spend money on infrastructure. It'd be kind of like, oh, let's put a statue of some well-known person and put it underground. Well, nobody's going to see the statue. It's stuff that you need that you may not be able to see it, but you know it works because you turn the tap on and you got quality water. You get to work on time. The bridge doesn't sway. People don't get sick. People are healthy. You know, so I guess in a sense, what we're talking about, the good infrastructure is what you need for a wealthy society, wealthy neighborhood, community. So this is how I was talking about civil engineers, American Society of Civil Engineers. Every year they have a scorecard. And their ranges for 2015 went from like B-, I think that was for public parks or something, to a D-. But overall, they're saying that the infrastructure systems of the U.S. deserve a D+. We've been deferring our maintenance too long. That's what they're saying. The next slide is, but this only rates the hard infrastructure. They're not talking about the education system, for example. They're not rating the police department, you know, public health, things of that sort that are soft infrastructure. And I'm going to be showing the different infrastructure systems on whether it's soft or hard and what the grade was for, go to the next one. Largely ignored by the public. So I asked this group of 7 people if they heard about the American Society of Civil Engineers, and there was a vague idea that maybe you saw something on the news, but this whole issue is largely ignored. You expect it to be done. Don't you pay taxes? What are they doing with that money? So you get the reverse reaction like Ted Cruz or Rand Paul saying, well, let's just make government smaller. Well, that'll make our water supply better. That'll fix potholes. I mean, so you get these false ideas or false prophets. The next idea was, well, I told you about the architect that said, oh, engineers are just making this up. I was flabbergasted when he said that. And no other professional in the room would speak up after knowing about infrastructure. The next one is, it's a big problem. Engineers are the wrong messengers. I think it needs to be mayors, city councils, county executives, governor, even the president of the United States, congressman, need to be aware of infrastructure and the need for it. And that's really what I'm trying to do with my standard, which I'm going to be talking about. There's different committees that are looking for putting funding packages together for bridges and roads, and And, it's tied with jobs, and it's not really sold in terms of the bigger picture of all the infrastructure. It's, my constituents include plumbers and electricians, so we need to give them jobs, and that's why we need this. So it's kind of like all this bargaining and such. It's not really focused on the needs for this commonwealth. It's kind of like a language. It's like we come to the city hall to get our goodies, and we put you in office, so why don't you get me more goodies and a lower tax? And let's keep on lowering the tax so I can get by, and somebody will pay it. Maybe somebody on welfare can give up their food stamps. I guess that's the point of what I'm trying to get to in my developing of a standard guide, to force the issue that, because right now there's an organization called the International City County Management Association. It's called ICMA, and it's primarily privately run cities or manager systems. It's not quite like New York City. It's maybe smaller, maybe like Suffolk County would have like people in the ICMA. And they say that the U.S. infrastructure we spend like $1 trillion a year on infrastructure right now. But the civil engineers are saying we need to spend $3.6 trillion. So what happens is it's primarily tax-exempt bonds. So the bank says, oh, we got these issues for tax-exempt bonds. People buy them. They use that money, and a cut goes to the private bank, and so then they go fix whatever it is. But that's only like a third of the money that's really needed. So things aren't getting fixed. So even you asked about the committee that's looking after what we're doing. They're probably doing the best that they can, but the whole system is set up so that we're not generating enough money to bring the common wealth, the common property, the infrastructure that we need. So they're doing a good job, but nobody's having their feet held to the fire. We all know that there's a lot of money being escape New York City, that it goes with the land rent that we're not collecting. That's what needs to go into improving the infrastructure. And I've got a diagram that goes into that a little bit. So this is what I'm talking about. What's needed is accountable and transparent public officials. Maybe if we had a political party that was on transparency and accountability, there would be an expectation of what you're doing in office. Maybe after 100 years they're all corrupt like everybody else, but at least you could have, I belong to the accountable and transparent political party. And we're...
Obama said he was going to be?
Well, yeah. So you have to hold people, that's the thing, is that here's my platform, and it's like after a month he's in office, you haven't done anything here. Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize, and he has all these drones killing people.
Yeah,
I mean, that's... So,
You were surprised.
so anyway, you need to hold people accountable. It's kind of like if you're like in the era where there was knights and people throwing rocks over your castle and stuff, and your leader isn't fighting back. You have to say, there's something wrong here. Maybe we need to throw those rocks back. So accountability. I think that's. We think that somebody's going to do it, but we got to look around and look in the mirror and see ourselves and talk to ourselves about what we're going to do about it. I don't know what the next point is here, but so management system, you can put that up pretty briefly. I'm going to go on from there and get into the infrastructure types. This is the guy who is interested in helping me develop this guide. He's into management systems, and they got management systems for quality control, environmental management, financial assurance and stuff. And it's all about when when an organization, it's typically a private organization, says, I want to attain this standard of quality in the operation of my business. And by doing that, they make higher profits, they can pay their workers better, it's all good. They do it in terms of, well, what is it that we're doing? Maybe they're building airplanes or something. So where's our materials come from? How do we know that we're getting the highest quality materials? So it goes into planning and operation, and then it's having people assess whether the performance is good, and then after a while, are there ways that we can improve this operation? In the management systems for environmental management, there's this challenge that this is how much air pollution your plant is doing. So every year there's a challenge, let's reduce it by 10%. So somebody would go and say, you don't need to have that vent on all the time. Why don't you just not do that? Maybe you can put the lid on that solvent can. So it gets down to that level in a management system for improvement. So I welcome his help, but it's not going to be the type of help that's on the bigger picture, because I'm looking at a change in the culture of how we run cities in a bigger picture. We need all these things to happen. We need the DEP, for example, in New York City, to keep the reservoirs clean upriver, which I've got a map in a second. So they need to do an efficient job so that the product that they produce is good quality and lowest possible cost, and pay their people well, and pay the pensions for the people that have foregone a private sector job and work for the government, and that's just the trade-off. So I'm going to go through the 14 types of infrastructure. We're getting near the middle of this. So water supply. Any disagreement that this is a type of hard infrastructure? There's pipes, there's reservoirs, So what's the grade that the ASCE gave? A D. So going across the United States, a low grade. I know in New Orleans, there's water pipes that were over 100 years old. They're made out of cypress logs. They worked a long time, but so cypress, they're waterproof, and so that might be the reason why they got a D here. So why don't we give an example? This is a tunnel from, I think, 1927 for New York City. I wanted to give an example that
What was that supply?
it's a water supply pipe for the Croton Aquifer. Notice that this is the Catskill area, this is the Croton area. This is where our water supply. Originally, Manhattan got its water supply within the island. And then they had to go to the Croton area because that was the nearest place you could get some good quality water. And then it didn't take too long before they realized New York City is booming, so why don't we fix this problem once and for all? So that's why we've got all these areas up here. And when people work for the DEP, they're assigned way up here. So they're getting a city paycheck, but they're up here managing the ecosystem so that there's not a hazardous waste site, for example, dumping stuff into the reservoir, which is going to go down into our water. So take note that that area looks like, I don't know, just the environment. I call that an example of nature as one of the 14 types of infrastructure, because there's a management aspect of keeping that clean, and it looks like it's wilderness, and in a sense it's wilderness, but there's somebody going around making sure that companies don't expand in a certain way. I know that there's people up there that are a little ticked off because of the limitations that New York City is placing on them, but we were there first. It's kind of like California getting water from Colorado. It's like, hey, you know, Los Angeles was there very early, and they did what they had to do to get their water. So you want to go back in time and debate this? Or, so what we have is New York City's water supply.
Where on that map is Indian Point?
I'm sorry?
Where on that map is Indian Point?
Indian Point.
Reactor that's leaking radiated water into the groundwater.
Well, I guess the good news, it's funny, good news, bad news. The good news for the water supply for New York City is that anything in the Hudson River just goes right out. Like all the PCBs from the GE plant,
Oh,
we don't have to worry about that in our water supply because that's in the Hudson River. I believe that the Indian Point is like right there. Be my guess. There's a point, and I can't read it, so, but it's somewhere north of New York City. So yeah, there's a lot of things that need to be addressed. That's kind of like I teach a course at Pace University in large ecosystem management, and one of the critiques that I have with the current operation of the Hudson Valley ecosystem is that it's just hit or miss. There's no coordination. There's hundreds of millions of dollars being spent to study this, to study that. It's kind of like, you know, we're doing research projects so people can get their degrees, which are all well and good, but there's not an overarching, let's bring the quality of the Hudson River to a certain quality by a certain time, and let's do these kind of things. There's not this, it's kind of like when we went transcontinental railroad, we kind of knew that we had to go to that other side, so if we go straight, you know, we're going to get there. There's not that sense of, we want this ecosystem to be clean, so we need to do this. It's like everybody's like, I need something to put on my poster because I'm a good environmentalist. This is my critique. Maybe if we had more money, they'd do stuff. But I'm not really sure that if there was more money put into that, which addresses some of the questions of, well, if we just throw more money at something, won't it be wasted? Well, yeah, I think in an example like that, you have to have an idea of, well, how do you get there? And are those the people who are going to get us there? So if those aren't the people that are going to get us there, maybe we should just wait till the people get in that are going to do it. So.
What is the condition of Central Parks?
The what?
Yeah, Central Parks, the reservoir, Central Park.
Central Park?
Does that get fed from the north?
No, we don't use that water. The water in the Central Park, I think, it overflows and then just goes out to the Hudson River. It's all for show.
Oh, the reservoir, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so infrastructure type number 2. We got a little bit of ways to go, and well, anyway. Number 2, food systems. So what kind of infrastructure is that? Everybody agree that food systems is kind of soft. It gets a little bit tricky talking about these things because somebody will say, well, doesn't the private sector provide that? But think about public health workers. Think about the regulations that restaurants have to follow. So it's not rated. So this is a critique that I've got against the civil engineers. They do it well for roads and bridges and dams and all those things because that's what they know, but they're not urban engineers like maybe like me that thinks about things holistically. So they're not going to put a rating there, but I think it's an important part of the commonwealth that we have, and that's why I've got these 14. So an example is the temperature of the meat that you cook. That's one of the things that the food inspectors do when they give those ratings of ABC. I think they probably go in there while they're cooking and they measure the temperature. So the next slide, sewage removal. We all know what that's all about. What's the type? So no disagreement, hard, there's just like water, there's pipes. What's the rating? So same thing. One of the problems in the Hudson River, for example, is fecal coliform. It's the waste from wastewater. And because the treatment plants are not sized well enough, you find fecal coliform all up and down the Hudson River. New York City has a big problem that every time it rains a half inch, it overloads the sewage treatment plants in the city and raw sewage goes out. If you do any kayaking in New York City, you'll see warning signs where they call it a combined sewer overflow. They say, well, don't kayak when there's a rainfall, because that's what you're going to get. You're going to get raw sewage, and it's going to be a problem. What's the next, I think is an example of, you can see where, you know, the sewage treatment reservoirs are out in nature, so there's nobody here complaining about the odors, you know. So this is an example of nature as an infrastructure type. Yeah. Yeah, we need to kind of, anyway, why don't we go to the next one? Number 4, we got 11 more to go. Buildings, hard infrastructure, rating D. Anybody remember what that is? 1945. That's the Empire State Building. It's a B-25 bomber flew into the Empire State Building. It what?
What floor did it hit?
I don't know. Looks like it was up there. Anyway, so that's a building. So when airplanes hit it, you need to fix it. Healthcare. So here's an example where, what type is it? Soft. It's not rated, you know. Some cities, they may not have a hospital nearby. So the healthcare system might be just the 911 operator, for example. So that might be all you have. Security. What type of infrastructure is this? Soft, right? I mean, it's police. I suppose you could say that the armored tanks that were out in Ferguson, Missouri would be an example of hard infrastructure, because we need to keep order and we need those tanks. But I would say that you know, policemen doing their job, you know, trying to keep order, that's kind of soft infrastructure. So it's not rated. And my example is, people familiar with this shot? I guess if you turn the lights off. Anybody familiar with the photo?
Oh yeah, that's the guy that was choked.
Yeah, Eric Garner. Yeah, I'm hoping that the lights are better. So it's really not funny, but I guess I was just shocking people that here's a challenge. Actually, let me pass this around, because I did a similar type of analysis as I did. Remember the page I had for Flint River, and I had the emergency manager. He needed the civil engineer to sign off on switching. So on this one, it's called acceptable soft infrastructure intervention. So this is, just imagine that Bill de Blasio has to sign off on whether to take down Eric Garner. So the proposed intervention, we need to get tough on African American males selling loose cigarettes in Staten Island. The next line was, I'm calling it passes the Flint criterion. Eric Garner will be no problem taking down with 8 officers present. So it's kind of like penny wise, pound foolish. You know, that's a question that people who want to do something different have to say. So it's infrastructure number 6. It's security, and so if you answer yes to any of these questions, So the question one was, respect for the law is lacking and stopping the selling of loose cigarettes is part of our broken window initiative where we stop activities at the start of a downslide in the community cohesion. Eric Garner is a threat to public order because he openly flaunts the prohibition on selling loose cigarettes. He must therefore be arrested at all costs. So this provides the continuity, like this is a decision, we all on board now? Or was this a decision that was Staten Island said, you know, I don't like that guy selling loose cigarettes. I think we'll just go after him. So what's been the effect of that? You know, you got lawsuits where we're spending millions of dollars, could be spent on something else because of poor decisions. And I'm saying this is the kind of thing that you should do in the standard that I'm proposing for a standard guide for infrastructure, where you do anything different than what you're doing now and you think it through. What could be the worst scenario? Well, this guy might die. So what are you going to do to prevent the opportunity for Eric Garner, for example, dying? Well, let's don't put him in a chokehold, and when he says, I can't breathe, maybe you should listen to him. You know, those kind of things. So the group that I'm putting together, I'm just throwing these ideas out. Is this the direction you want to take this infrastructure standard guide? I'm thinking it might be. Power. So what kind of infrastructure type is it? Hard. We can all agree. You know, power plants, coal, natural gas, you know. And what did the ASCE grade? So a D+. So let's give an example of, this is the Upper Harlem. You see this cloud here? So what just blew up?
Building collapse, right?
The what?
Gas.
Yeah, natural gas. They had a pipeline that was 100 years old, and everybody smelled it. Nobody did anything. You know, I wrote the letter to the New York Times, and I said, anybody, yeah, I said, anybody who calls a 100-year-old natural gas pipeline an asset is an idiot. But that's what they would call it. It's one of our assets, you know, that we have to change out. Well, you know, you need to change these things out. Or you might need to develop houses that work on the passive house principle that don't need natural gas, so you kind of avoid the problem. You increase the community wealth by using less energy. So it's a smart concept. So we can go to the next type. We got several more.
Do you build in a passive way?
I'm sorry?
Do you build apartment buildings, passive energy?
I could advise on them. Actually, there was a large office building that was built on the passive principle. It's I'd say within the last month, I see a big surge within the architect community of considering the passive house principles. I used to go to meetings on passive house, and you get like 20 people there, and I got my certification back in 2011, and now it's like a lot of interest. So the next one is communications. Hard infrastructure, not rated because it's not, well, it's not a civil engineer thing. I guess maybe the American Society of Electrical Engineers might have an opinion about this. And that's the reason why I'm thinking we need to be holistic. So what's the next one? Yeah, the lighting is bad. So this was kind of like, ha-ha, funny, because here's the police, here's Apple, here's the cell phones that they want to crack open here. So communications, cell phones, and you know. Transit and travel, 9, we're getting close to the end. That would be a hard D. You know, all these things are, you know, past their prime. And I've got an example of a high-speed train in China. They're building, I think they're building another train to Tibet in China. They already got one. So, go to the next. Waste disposal. Would be hard D. So the photo is some waste just accumulating on the beach there. Go to the next one. Education. Soft. It's not rated. Civil engineers don't look at the quality of the education, but we need to, think about this. I know it's a big Sanders program where college would be free. And if you think about it, what's the harm in having a smart population? Isn't there a value in promoting education, having more people that are trained and thinking through things, even if they leave the free college and go into these positions where they have to think about signing these kind of reviews and saying, my job is to make sure that the infrastructure is well kept. And so the example is, I put the search for a school marm, and that's what showed up. So that's education, people listening to a teacher. Number 12, cultural heritage. Now, you've got hard, not rated. New York has all sorts of museums. And here's one example of a museum in New York City. We can go to the next one. It's a museum of sex. That was supposed to be a joke. 13 is recreation and entertainment, soft. C minus. I guess it's easier to maintain, I guess. Or people wouldn't go to the entertainment if you had seats that broke. So maybe, so people put a lot of value in this kind of experience. So the government would probably pay a contractor to keep the park up and all those. C minus. This is an example of a stadium. So the last one is nature. Soft, of course. It's not D minus. I'm trying to remember the category that said it was D minus. I think it had to do with like wetlands and other kind of things. So the example I had was, the mountains in the background, a river that's not impacted by pollution and other kind of impacts. So now that I've gone through the 14 types of infrastructure, before we leave this one, this is like an example up in the Catskills where this might be the water that comes down to New York City. So even though it's not like policemen out there making sure that people don't urinate or that whatever might happen would impact, it's like you keep human impacts away. So it's like, typically infrastructure, you do something, you crank it, but this is where you stand back and you provide a buffer, and that's how you maintain the value of that. So it's kind of like a real environmentalist, even though I call myself one, there would be some environmentalists who would say, you can't call nature infrastructure. It's like, but I'm saying it in terms of how society treats it. So if you stay away from it, I think a lot of people would say, oh, you're doing a good job. Now the rest of these, where does the money coming from? And actually, this is the heart of the Georgist material in this. So if imagine, at a conference tomorrow, it's about the next system. You would think that they're open to challenging ideas, new ideas, old ideas that have been forgotten but maybe are relevant now. So here I come presenting Georgist stuff. So where does money come from? And remember, I had these learning moments. So we're getting away from this other stuff. Delusion of a piggy bank. Banks do not lend out the savings of depositors. Everybody understand that concept? There's a guy named Richard Werner. Actually, I got a copy, but if you just put in the Richard Werner and talk about create money out of nothing, the paper will come up. So once you understand that concept, it's revolutionary, just like that where labor's wages comes from and the whole Georgist theorem, because why are we paying private banks to loan money so that we can fix infrastructure? Maybe we should have a public bank that has no private interest to loan the money. It's kind of like credit to fix the infrastructure. so that when it's up and running, you're generating wealth that gets plowed back into it. So this is a very revolutionary concept. I call it the delusion of the piggy bank because you talk to most people and they say, of course, we put money in the bank and the bank gives that money to somebody else and they make a little bit of profit. Well, that's not the way it works. And we need to get away from that idea. So the next learning moment is money is not wealth. I've got a chart coming up in a second that shows that money is not wealth. Money is a means of exchange of wealth. Listen to your grandmother and stay healthy. That's where wealth is. You know, you go to sleep and you didn't brush your teeth for 5 years, and no, you need to brush your teeth. You know, that's wealth. You know, because you're going to be spending money on dentist bills in the future. Cities with good infrastructure are wealthy cities. Fraud of the 2008 bailout of private banks. Let's ask Selena Gomez what she thinks. Anybody saw The Big Short?
Yes.
Okay. So there she is.
Was
And
she pretty short?
what? Yeah. She gave, I guess in my opinion, she did she was there with some economists, but she did an excellent job of explaining what collateralized debt obligations are, which is what collapsed the economy in 2008. So you take mortgages and you bundle them together and then you market those. And so it ended up like somebody in the background was betting that Selena was going to do something and then they would bet on that. So it was like this big pyramid of hypothetical gambling bets. So that's essentially what she was saying is what is the reality out there right now. So the fraud of the 2008 bailout was that they didn't fix anything. Dodd-Frank isn't going to fix anything. In fact, Dodd-Frank has a provision in it that allows for that negative interest rate where you put money into the bank and you have to pay to have money in a bank. I'd like to start up a bank like that. I'll get a piece of cardboard and say bank and negative interest rates. Yeah, okay. So anyway, so the fraud of so people would complain about, well, we can't have bailouts anymore. So the smart people would say, okay, we'll have bail-ins. That's what the paying the bank to put the money there. That's what a bail-in is. And I don't know how they snooker people into going with this, but so right now there's about $1.5 quadrillion in these types of investments that Selena Gomez was talking about. Now you got stocks and debt and stuff, but you know the most of it is this. Well, you would call it money. It'd be digits in a computer someplace. That's just bets and gambling type positions. They're obligations. They're not money. They're not wealth. They're just there, and they're sucking the resources out of our economy that are represented here. You got, what was that, $16 trillion that money that it's earned banks, might be in Greece and other places. And they're trying to service this derivative because the derivatives in the law of the United States might be worldwide is that those get paid off first. So if Puerto Rico is going down, if Greece goes down, you let those degrade, but you have to respect this. And I guess those are the people who elect the politicians and such. So what I had on my chart was, why don't we just get rid of this stuff and we can all sleep better? You know, because it's like the next crisis that comes along, we can't be sitting still and say, well, there they go again, they're bailing out another bank. I mean, we can't let that happen. We know that this is the reality. It's worse than it was in 2008. So that was part of that learning moment. I just got a few more slides to go. I think it's important in terms of Georgist ecology to understand what we've been told, what we've been lied to, so that we can compare it to something that works. Now, Daniel Bromley in his book, and I mentioned vulnerable people, vulnerable states, he talks about the problem with this Washington consensus. In fact, that's where I got these 10 items here.
I only see 3 and they're too little to see.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to have to, I'll read them out to you. So the Washington consensus, I got 10 items. Fiscal discipline. Let me get my little cheat sheet out here that I... Okay, fiscal discipline in the Washington consensus typically means low taxes, limited government. It's like discipline. Get your act together. We can't be spending money on all these superfluous things. Reorder public expenditure priorities. So it's like the dam is about to break. So don't you think we should be spending money on that first? And then these other things that haven't broken yet, like the interstate bridge that might fail tomorrow. We can let that go because it's been sitting there for 50 years. We can squeeze out another year out of that. Reorder public expenditure priorities. So it's another example of we don't have enough money to do everything. Well, why? Well, nobody's asked us that question. Well, we know where the money would come from. We're Georgists. We understand about Texas tax reform. Let me keep on going on this. And liberalize interest rates. I think we kind of know that this is a lot of neoliberal economic thinking. We're the job creators. You need to give us a tax break. We're in this upper 1% and we just rule the world. So that's what Washington Consensus is. Washington Consensus is also talking to Middle East and African countries saying that you need to be like us. You need to have trade liberalization. You need to have free trade. Forget about manufacturing in your own country because we've got products to sell you. So it's this one size fits all. This is the way you do it. And then we'll loan you money. And then you'll never get out of debt because the debt that the money that goes into these African and Middle East countries, the interest rates go up and they never get out of that problem. That's the Washington Consensus. And that after 50 years of fighting poverty, you have nothing to show for it. And that was really the thesis of Daniel Bromley's Vulnerable People, Vulnerable States. And the other one was liberalize foreign direct investment, privatization, deregulation, property rights. So all these things fit into that whole thrust of the TPP and all of these other free trade agreements that we hear a lot about in the debates. So why don't we go to the next slide and essentially say it's failed. If you're a billionaire and you made a lot of money on it, I suppose it worked. But when I talk about whether something works or doesn't work, I'm talking about society at large. Yeah. Look at the date here, 1684, a guy named Horneck. He was kind of like the father of the German economic tradition. 1648 was the end of the 30 Years' War. In some areas, 70% of the population was wiped out. So the whole basis of the German economic theory was we need to get out of the chaos that the aftermath of this 30 Years' War and start developing our country. These principles or points I'm going to be listing here have been used by countries around the world to their success. It's the kind of thing that you do when you don't want to be colonized, you don't want to be monopolized. This is how you start your economy. So for a Western country to go into Africa and say, you need to be like us. So well, wait a minute, how did you get to be where you were? Didn't you follow these kind of things? Well, yeah, but I'm here to take over your resources. No, so the first point, I just want to point out that 1684, that's clearly about 100 years before Adam Smith. And I had a slide here from last week They show that the Smith tradition is really about trade and bartering. The German tradition is more about production and distribution. So you consider all agricultural possibilities. That was his first idea. Even though he was big in manufacturing, he was saying every plot of land that you've got in your nation, look at the possibilities of this species, of that species, this climate. Don't leave anything unchecked. Manufacturing over the resource sale. So it's like rather than Russia selling gas and oil and all their resources, look to manufacturing and sell the manufacturing products because it higher paid jobs and you get a higher revenue from that. Educate the population into professions. I mean, this is 1684. This is exactly what Dr. Adam was talking about. We're getting away from careers and now we just have jobs. You know, well, why did we forget these? Well, I guess we never learned this. We didn't learn this in our economics class. Yeah. So what's the number 4? Circulate gold and silver as money. Now this is one of the things where the German economists are criticized as mercantilists, that they're just focused on gold and silver, where the bad example of that was Spain. And I don't know if people are familiar with this, but they essentially shut down their manufacturing after they got all this gold and silver from Latin America and South America. It was a curse because they let their country go to pot. What he was talking about was, you don't have a printing press for currency, use the gold and silver as your currency. It's no big magical idea. He was saying, don't let that gold and silver get out of the country, just keep on circulating it because it has an inherent worth and it's stable. Pursue import substitution. This is something that
American countries did in the Latin American countries.
yeah, Latin American, they look to these kind of ideas. They may not know the origin of this, but they know that it works. They're developing their country. Any foreign goods for domestic wares. So if you do have to get some foreign goods, give them in barter or something, things that you've got left over. There's a book by Jane Jacobs, which is really kind of interesting. Jane Jacobs was really focused on New York City and against Robert Moses and all this. And then she writes these economic books that get into Latin America, and she's talking about the import substitution and other. So I would suggest looking at Jane Jacobs. I can't remember what the name of the book is, but maybe just put in import substitution, development economics. Okay, so what's the last 3? Import foreign goods unfinished. So create them here. It'd be kind of like Honda having goods brought here and we put on the tires and maybe we put on the fenders or something.
NASA did that.
So it's kind of like at every opportunity, don't import something that somebody else built over there, paid all their workers, create to manufacturing jobs here. Sell foreigners excess goods for gold and silver. It's kind of like trying to build a nest egg, essentially what he was doing. Don't import that which can be found domestically, even if it was at a higher cost. So this is the idea of...
Oh, wow. That's loaded.
Yeah. So it's the idea of you got this community and let's say, I'm going to buy this widget. You know, I could buy the one that's made in China, but I could make this one that's made 2 blocks away and it's, rather than 5 cents, it's 10 cents. Or maybe it's even 50 cents. But the fact that that plant is open and it hires the teacher and the fireman and all these, this is the circulation of money. So that's the principle behind this. Is that was the...
No, actually, I don't think it's a good idea. But
Say this is the poison that the standard economics gives you, is that you so focused on price that you'd screw your neighbor. That I'm going to get that widget really close, and that 5 cents that I saved, I guess maybe in 30 years I can fly to Texas or something.
That's what happened, they chased that.
Yeah, I grew up around Detroit. My hometown is Monroe, Michigan. That's where Monroe-Matic shock absorbers are built. It's where Lazy Boy chairs are built. My dad worked for Monroe Auto Equipment, and that moved to Tennessee first, and he decided not to go there. Well, you know, from there it went to Mexico, and then it went, you know. So that's that poison that we need to cheapen things, get workers paid less money. We all know, we're all Georgists, so we kind of know that there's a fraud going on here, that there's money that's not being captured to employ. But so these are the principles that for development economics, they're true 300 years ago on a nationwide basis, but these are the kind of things to think about for neighborhoods, for states, as opposed to the so-called Washington Consensus. So let me go a few more lessons, and then we wrap it up for tonight. We don't need to go over this, but I have this argument for tomorrow, so we can just buzz through this. We talk about labor's wages coming from produced wealth. So one more. Okay, now so here's our Georgist moment here, and we're almost done. So imagine a city that doesn't have a land value tax. It's not very hard to imagine that because there's not too many that have them. So let's say 5 years ago, the federal government gave us 50 units of something. So the city is valued at, say, 50 units. So getting a credit of 50 is a pretty significant increase. So what's the next slide? So you get a modest revenue. So Yanni, what do you think the reason is we get a modest revenue even though we pump this value and there's value there? You think there's a mechanism of collection that might be deficient here? This is pre-land value taxation. So this is the operation of before you have a Georgist system where you properly collect socially generated value. So what's the next one? So let's say today we say, oh, we figured out a way of generating wealth.
What do you mean by most modest revenue? That's not very clear. So credit.
I'm just saying that we're letting landlords get away with not paying their fair share into the fund that can go back into, because of all those investments we made and people are good and honest people. We're collecting the land value taxation. We're getting the land values. So 50 comes out, we make public investments at 10. So we're updating bridges, we're improving the health care, we're training police so they don't kill people in Staten Island, those kind of things. What's the next? So in 5 years, look, we've doubled the land value. We're getting 75 and putting 25. So for a little bit of credit to kick this thing off and come up with this a method for reinvesting land value, we're constantly increasing land value. So the last one, and you know, I'm saying 20 years, so we're 1,000 and we're getting 500. So we've developed a technique to pay for those infrastructure that we've been talking about. They're all deficient. $3.6 trillion. This is a possible mechanism to think about in terms of the next system, the way of where we might look to improve the community. So help create a standard guide for infrastructure. I'm the lead for the development of this. This is the work item number in the American Society of Testing Materials. It's called Public Infrastructure Management. I'm looking to craft a guide that would be used by public officials. It's San Antonio, April 13th. If you're interested, you can get on the conference call or you can show up in San Antonio. The next one. I foresee 2 columns of information. how much is spent on the 14 types of infrastructure, and where does the money come to pay for it? So that's the challenge. I think it was about 2 years ago, there was a report done for Scott Stringer, and it shows that right now, at least 2 years ago, there's $1 billion ready to be collected for vacant property. The Joshua Vincent, who's the CEO of the Center for the Study of Economics in Philadelphia. So he was, well, we're both working with state legislatures, and our approach is, let's start off with the idea of collecting the land rent from the vacant properties to $1 billion. Now, you could spend it a lot of different ways, but there's like a reasonable person would have no problem with that proposition. That's why I had that slide up there. This slide came off the internet, and it was somebody talking about Georgist philosophy, and I've never seen this slide before, but it says, the supply and demand diagram shows the effect of land value taxation. Note that the burden of the tax is entirely on the landowner, and there is no deadweight loss. So I just wanted to end it on that, see feedback on that. So I guess what...
How would you explain that? How would you explain that?
Well, I guess I'm not going to show this tomorrow. I just wanted to show this group. But I guess what... so maybe...
But not at the end, of course. But,
yeah. The quantity of some product, the supply is pretty stable. I guess this is... the supply is the land, right, Yanni? I mean, this is what the diagram is showing. So the price for that land has the revenue for the value that you can go back to society, but the consumer is getting what the landowner collects plus something that's the increment for the land value. So the market price is there, not here. So it's like paying back to society for the value that were put in over the years.